I guess we can go ahead and kick this meeting.
Yeah. John, I think you're on. I think you're on mute over there.
Eh? Eh?
Yeah, can't hear you. Okay. I guess let's just do this thing. Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode one. On this podcast, we demystify what it is to be in the working world. So, just a few years ago, I was in college thinking about graduating, maybe getting a job, making some money, and I really didn't know, what all these titles meant, how companies really put the different departments together, and where my skill set and interests might fit into corporate America. And so essentially on this podcast, I'm going to be having on some different guests who have interesting jobs that you may want to learn more about and maybe do in the future. So today I'm really excited to kick things off with a really amazing guest who I've known for a very long time and who was gracious enough to be experimental guest number one on the podcast. He is a longtime friend and co-conspirator in my general career and life plans, and I'm really excited to have him on. John Latham, welcome to the podcast.
Alex, thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. I think we talk enough, but not in this formal setting where we're both on our best behavior. So looking forward to exploring some of these questions with you.
Awesome. Okay, so let's just jump into it. So we're going to start things off with what you do now. So first off, can you tell us a little bit about the industry you're in and your company's place in that industry at a high level?
Yeah, so from a very high level, I work in healthcare on the supply chain side. Healthcare is unique in that anything that's purchased by a healthcare system, or a large majority of things that are purchased that are non-payroll spend, so anything in the supplies and services sector, is going to be done through a group purchasing organization. So that's functionally a entity that aggregates buying power and then negotiates on behalf of the healthcare system with the suppliers of the products and services to provide best-in-class pricing. So my company is a wholly owned subsidiary of Ascension Health, which is the largest not-for-profit healthcare chain in the U.S., accounting for around 4% of total healthcare spending in the U.S. So a very large portion relative to what kind of the national market share is. So as a wholly owned subsidiary, we're going to differentiate a little bit from a standard purchasing organization or GPO in that we manage the supply chain end to end. So that means anything that involves a supply getting from the manufacturer into the hands of our physicians is ultimately incumbent upon the resource group. So everything from logistics, distribution, picking and pulling in the hospitals, sourcing, figuring out what products are on contract is all incumbent upon our company. So the resource group has about 500 associates in 20 states. And then reporting into those 500 are an additional 2,000 or so workers that work in the hospital in supply chain functions, but are employed by our parent company. So from a very high level, the short answer is we provide products and services for healthcare systems.
Gotcha. So a couple things I want to dig in there before we get into your specific role. So first off, Ascension is a not-for-profit health system, and you dropped there that it accounts for 4% of national healthcare spending. So obviously it's very significant in size. So this isn't like some regional, just local charity type thing. It's a very substantial organization. Can you enlighten a little bit on what the difference is between how the nonprofit aspect affects the company, and the fact it's not publicly traded, right? Because publicly traded companies are for profit. So what exactly does it mean that it's nonprofit, and does that actually affect the day-to-day operations in any way that you've noticed?
So it does in a sense, and I'll answer that in two parts. So first of all, from the Ascension perspective, and second of all, from the resource group perspective, because the two perspectives are different. So from the Ascension kind of point of view on this, I think it does definitely affect the way the company runs, because instead of driving towards increasing shareholder value, it's driving towards achieving the mission of supporting the poor and vulnerable. So in healthcare, you're looking at serving patients, and a part of that is the payer mix. So if it's heavily private insured, or if you're in an affluent area, or if you're in an area that's primarily Medicare, Medicaid, and those reimbursements are different, which will ultimately flow through and affect the bottom line. So while Ascension has to be cognizant of the financial pressures and make sure that they continue as a going concern, it's not necessarily about driving the maximum dollar amount to the bottom line. And if there is a profit margin over the last year or so, profit margins for Ascension have been between 1% and 2%. A lot of that delta is going to be made up for in donations, so billions of dollars of donations to those who can't afford healthcare and those types of things. So from the Ascension perspective, it is truly a mission-driven organization that has to make decisions that are not just based upon kind of the economic output and the bottom line of the income statement. The resource group, while still sharing in that mission and those goals, as a wholly owned subsidiary, is kind of it takes on some of the pressure of being an economic performer. So generating revenues through the GPO function, and giving that money back to Ascension. So all of that does flow back through to the parent company. But as a wholly owned subsidiary that's basically servicing an internal customer, I think that is a little bit more of your standard environment where, while the mission is still front and center, there's still a lot of kind of performance pressures that are maybe more aligned with what you would see in some other systems. So even though
Gotcha.
under the not-for-profit umbrella, it's still that consulting dynamic as well.
Gotcha. I see. So essentially, like in a nutshell, Ascension can maybe open some hospitals and operate in markets where it would be very difficult for a purely for-profit provider to justify opening a hospital in that area. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, in some cases that can be certainly what's happening. And there are, of course, very prestigious. There's learning centers. It covers a wide swath of different acute care centers. So it's not as if all of these are just serving in underprivileged areas and those types of things, but it's just a consideration.
Gotcha. Okay, so then the resource group where you work, wholly owned subsidiary of Ascension, and you mentioned that the resource group covers the entire end-to-end spectrum of supply chain, and you mentioned sourcing. And so if you're listening to this and you're a senior in college and you haven't gotten to the business world, you might not be familiar with necessarily the sourcing function. Supply chain makes sense, acquiring supplies, getting them from point A to point B. But can you give a little bit more color on what exactly sourcing and contracting is in that process, and how they work together and what exactly they mean?
Yeah, so I can kind of speak to that from our organization's perspective, certainly. So this is outside of even procurement, where our organization is not necessarily in charge of cutting all of the POs or those types of things. When we talk about
a PO,
a purchase order, that's a great question. I remember not knowing what that was for probably longer than I should admit in my initial role. So from the sourcing side, that involves negotiating and implementing contracts. So in the healthcare space, there are a lot of unique products that do not have competitors, and you have a very uphill battle in trying to negotiate a price with the supplier because they have, in essence, a miniature monopoly. Then there are also more commoditized items in product lines. If you're looking at things that maybe used by nursing, things like exam gloves can be a little bit more commoditized than a pacemaker or something like that. So when we're talking about the sourcing function within the resource group, we're really looking at two parts of it, because these are highly preferential items and they're highly technical items. The team that I work on works directly with the end users, which are physicians and leadership and staff within the hospital that are using the products on a day-to-day basis and ultimately have them delivered into their hands to serve the patients. So we work with these groups to help define the attributes of the products, which is a unique part of the way the resource group runs their model. We're not looking at sort of brand recognition or maybe company sort of reputation and those types of things. The model focuses on looking at the attributes of the product, of the supplies, and then allowing our decision-making bodies who are embedded within the system and are, the employees in the hospital, the physician groups and those types of people to make decisions based upon those attributes. So once those decisions have been made and the clinical sort of criteria are established, then a design individual like myself who is designing the parameters of what those products need to look like will pass it to a sourcing dyad partner who will then negotiate with the supplier to make sure that that we can write a contract that will allow us to buy it at the correct value. So it's kind of a hand-in-hand process that can go back and forth a little bit. But as a whole, the design and the sourcing dyad are trying to write contracts, make available products that our end users can use at the best value.
And just to be clear, you're not designing the product, you're designing the, I guess, spec, like the spec sheet of which type of product the team needs, right? I mean, the product already exists. You're coming up with the details of exactly the criteria that the doctors and the decision makers at the hospital are sort of okay with having in the final product that's selected.
Yes, that's exactly right. It can be that, it can be the strategy behind the contract. So do we need to standardize for clinical reasons? Do we want to not have 4 or 5 different types of stents being used across Ascension? Is there a way to drive towards the standardization so that if a patient goes into a hospital in Austin, Texas versus in Indianapolis, are they going to get maybe a more similar level of clinical care? So our physicians will direct that if it is clinically beneficial, but there are a lot of different elements that go into that, but you're absolutely right. We're not engineers that are designing new products.
Yeah. Just wanted to clarify that. So what I want to go 2 different directions with this role, from like thinking about your role from the CEO's perspective of your company, the high level value proposition. I guess, can you get a little bit into the tactical strategies that your team is using to actually drive value for your partners out at the hospitals?
So, negotiations can be fairly sensitive, so you can't really dive kind of too deep into those types of details. But I think from the CEO's perspective, we are something that we kind of say within our organization is that we are hospitality organization first, and because the entire function of the resource group is to deliver high value things to the end users who again are the kind of internal customer, a lot of what we do is responding to those needs of the end users. So it's not necessarily just the price negotiation. There's a lot that goes into the maintenance and the relationship building and those types of things in facilitating those relationships, not only with our suppliers, but also with our end users. But ultimately, there is a need to drive cost out of healthcare. And that is kind of the ultimate value proposition of a supply chain that is also managing the purchasing, is to, take the expense portion of the profit and loss statement and minimize it. So across healthcare, if you look at the supplies and purchase services expense in a health system, it'll tend to be around 20%. So within our model, we've driven it well below that through these different kind of unique delivery mechanisms. So that is ultimately one of the biggest deliverables, I think, from the resource group to Ascension. But there's, again, that focus on being agile and responding to different types of problems as they come up.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And you mentioned standardization of care as one of the ways in which you can cut out some of that operating expense line. And that makes sense because obviously to some degree, aggregating buying power would be an important lever in cost reduction. Can you talk about the obvious tension that exists there between standardizing care across a lot of different hospitals and the tension between that and making sure patients get the specific care that they need when they actually do show up at the hospital?
Yeah, so I think fortunately, I'm non-clinical, right? I don't have a clinical background. We have a lot of people in the resource group that are clinical, but those decisions and determinations are made by the people who are working with the patients every day. So that is a portion of it. A lot of the clinical, variation reduction and those types of things are not necessarily going to be directed by supply chain, but rather supported by supply chain. So if there's an instance where there is, a product that is considered clinically acceptable and it is going to be able to serve the patient's need, then the decision-making bodies with representatives across the country can say, this is what we need to use. And, every location will follow suit if that's what that decision-making body decides. But that's something that's coming directly from our end users and allowing them to kind of make that determination, because ultimately they're the ones that are using the products to treat the patient.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so I think that really should give the listeners a pretty good idea of how the resource group fits into a Ascension more broadly, and how sourcing and contracting partners with the decision makers in the hospitals on those decisions. So I wanted to get a little bit more specific in terms of your day-to-day activities. So can you for somebody who's in school, hasn't really been in the workplace yet, or maybe is already out in the workplace but in a very different role, maybe they're in marketing at a media company or something, and they want to get a better understanding of sort of what the day-to-day looks like, the team structure, the nature of the work, and the flow of things, deliverables, the kind of, and the sort of meetings versus deliverables, and what that looks like on a weekly basis.
Yeah, so I think a lot of employers and people will say that their job is different and exciting and it changes from a day-to-day basis. But I think that's especially true within the design role specifically, because while there's cycles of what you're working on, they're like 2 to 3 year cycles, because you're looking at specific contracts as they come up. And then any questions that may come up around those contracts, or if you have a product recall and need to find a substitute, or if you have a patient safety issue, or if you have an FDA approval that disrupts the market, if you have new clinical data coming out, all these different types of things you have to react to and try to be prepared for. So it's not as if you're just on this cadence of sign a document and then we're good there for 36 months or 24 months or whatever it may be. So there isn't really a way to say here is the day-to-day basis and the standard deliverables that are provided. But with that, there is some structure. So you'll have your decision-making bodies that will meet on a regular cadence. And so that will typically be monthly at the most frequent, and then ad hoc or quarterly at the least frequent. So in preparing, new technologies for those groups to review, kind of reviews of current strategies, there's implementations ongoing where a product is being moved out, which in an organization our size is a giant lift from an implementation and operations perspective, just to burn down existing inventory and replace it with a new inventory. So those types of things and those discussions, and then discussing anything on the clinical side, certainly if there's new data that's come into the view of the group and those types of things. So I think those meetings are kind of what you would kind of have your week or month rotate around in preparation for that. And then when you're looking at contracts, so specifically I have 60 plus contracts that I manage. When those are up for expiration, if they're in the same category, they'll be expiring at the same time. So you'll be working at a greater initiative with a set of contracts. So you'll be working through RFIs and RFPs, 12 and 9 months out, respectively, on those.
Which are
Request for proposal and request for information. Thanks for keeping me honest.
And those are documents that you're sending out to suppliers to get more information about their products and pricing.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, and so I think a big difference in the model that we have versus other sourcing jobs, beyond just a technical differentiation in the products, is the delineation of the roles. So some sourcing functions can be cradle to grave. So you manage everything from the analytics to the implementation of what you purchase, where ours is very delineated. It's contract design would set the strategy, sourcing would negotiate the terms, implementation would enact the strategy, and operations would maintain the strategy, all being supported by an analytics team. So you have 4 or 5 different teams, not to mention teams that are involved in the data maintenance and those types of things. So you have all these different teams interacting in one degree or another, passing things off to each other, but then continuing to work together, as opposed to having ownership of something throughout a process, from the beginning to the end. So that certainly, I think, is a difference. If there's anyone watching this that may have been involved in other sourcing organizations in the past.
Gotcha. So I'm hearing you're having regular meetings with the decision makers. You're on a cycle when new contracts are up. You're sending out requests to different suppliers to essentially pitch you on why you should go with them. And then so in terms of the contract design, so you get information back from a supplier on an RFP, and I guess you get a few responses that suppliers you're going to compare versus each other, and you're going to work with the decision team. Once the decision has been made, are you actually writing the contract, or is that part of the process that what does that handoff look like? How do you push it down that multi-team process that you mentioned?
So there's an aspect where there's input from the design side on how the contract is being designed, but all of our contracts are based around a terms and conditions template. It's like a 140-page document that there's extensive negotiation around the various clauses, everything from inventory management to liability and responsibilities, and everything you can obviously think of when you've been writing these contracts for 10 or 12 years. So that is done by the sourcing side. If there are things that are specific to the strategy, if it's a single source position, or if there's a committed amount of business or those types of things, category definitions, then design will weigh in on those, but it's incumbent upon sourcing to write those deals.
Gotcha. So would it be fair that your team is essentially determining the strategy for the contract and ensuring that the doctors and other decision makers at the hospitals are on board, and then sourcing is actually going out and, from a legal contracting perspective, executing on that strategy?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So we're user directed. So we don't necessarily make the strategies. We respond to what the end users need, and then sourcing will work through that as you're kind of talking about. There's legal support for that. So any contract, of course, we actually do have lawyers on our sourcing team, but in terms of the legal function and the support, that's from a specific team that has, of course.
Gotcha. Yeah. So what do you think is the cooler part of the process in terms of how it's split up at the resource group, the contract design or the sourcing side?
Well, they both have their benefits and kind of the things that make them interesting and things that make them difficult. And I can't say which one is better or more interesting than the other. On the design side, it's really the end user engagement that can be rewarding. And then on the sourcing side, that's where the rubber meets the road and the value needs to be delivered at the end users that's stipulated. So both of them are integral, and you couldn't really do your job without the other, having confidence that your dyad member is doing theirs.
Yeah, and I have a feeling that, and I'm not 100% sure on this, but I think in some organizations, sourcing and contracting may be more integrated Um, I have a feeling that given how complex the hospital space is, that may be partly why it's separated into two groups, but I honestly am not sure. I've never worked in that side of the business, but I would imagine that dynamic may be different at different companies.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, even within healthcare, it seems fairly unique because we talk to suppliers and we have to explain them our model. And oftentimes they're used to dealing with an individual point of contact for everything instead of
Yeah.
needing to work through this process.
Yeah, and actually part of why is it so complex? I was just thinking about as you're talking, it's because of what you're buying and who you're buying it for, right? And can you talk about what are some of the items that your group actually does help a hospital source?
Yeah, certainly. So I think the last time I'd seen a number on it, it's $7.2 billion in supply and services that Ascension purchases or that the resource group negotiates contracts
I
for.
hope that's a public number.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
It's yeah, we're proud of the scope of kind of what is being managed. Um, so some of the bigger categories in healthcare are going to be orthopedics and spine. Those can be very profitable procedures, but with that being said, the supplies and the implants that go into them are extremely expensive. Obviously, pharmacy is going to be a very large driver. Pharmacy, you obviously work on the pharmacy side, so you're familiar with some of those dynamics. But that's around 5%, I think, 5 to 7-ish% of total supply expense spend, or total expense rather. So about a third of the supply budget is a big one. And then I work a lot with the cardiovascular space. So that's all the implants, pacemakers, defibrillators, implantable loop recorders, those types of things. And then anything that is used to, for interventions with heart patients. So stenting, all of the things that you use in a stent case, the catheters, the sheaths, those types of things. So those are some of the big ones. And then you start thinking, if you go into a hospital and you'll see just kind of closer to the patient's room, you'll see these carts that have, the slip and fall, the different, toothbrushes and different things for the patient room, the bedpans, everything like that. So there's, hundreds and hundreds of contracts with millions of SKUs across the portfolio.
Yeah, so some of this stuff is actually getting implanted into the patient at the end of the day.
Yeah, correct. So everything from like a, expensive pacemaker all the way down to the food and environmental services are sourced through the resource group.
Gotcha. Yeah. So that should clarify a little bit what's going on there. So how long have you been with the resource group, and can you walk us through the career progression up to this point?
Yeah, so I started with the resource group in 2016, shortly after graduating from the University of Missouri's now defunct MBA program. So graduated in 2016. I'd actually done a lot of my prep work in finance, having taught finance in my graduate program to undergraduates and taken CFA courses, which is geared towards investments. When I started doing the job search process, I got really interested in healthcare and wanted to instill that analytic kind of quantitative capacity. So I did get a job with the resource group, supporting our local ministry in Chicago, a very large health system called Amida's in Chicago. So working directly with the team there, the operations team, the implementation team that sit within our hospitals and help manage things on a day-to-day basis, and reporting directly in to the VP there, that is kind of the equivalent of a VP of supply chain. So reporting directly into them and supporting their conversations with the CFOs as they're managing the monthly budgets and those types of things. So started there, worked there for just under 2 years. And
what was your title in that role?
So started as an analyst 2, and then moved back to St. Louis, which is closer to home for me. I'm from Southwest Missouri, as you know. moved back to St. Louis, where our corporate headquarters for both the Resource Group and Ascension are, and took a job in contract design, started as an agent, and then moved into a manager position about a year ago.
Gotcha. So I guess in terms of that progression, how did you manage that process of sort of indicating that you wanted to move in that direction? How'd those conversations get started, and was there a strategy, or was it just something that sort of came about as you got more into your original role in Chicago?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't know how much you and I have actually even talked about this, but right towards kind of about a year before I left Chicago, I started working on a project that was a little bit more in the weeds than anything I'd done before. It was helping standardize the inventory levels of the cath lab storerooms. So that involved going through and looking at what types of different catheters, wires, sheaths, and stents they had on their shelves, meeting on a weekly basis with kind of the two lead cardiologists and vascular surgeons there, as well as the vice president of the cardiovascular service line, and working through that project. So that kind of got me interested more on the technical medical attribute side.
And are those people you were working with, are they the type of people who would potentially be on a decision team for determining which products go in? Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly right. So when I started, when you start off in a company, it's a huge company, complex structure and organization and all these different roles. I couldn't have even told you what a contract design agent did, or what the difference between design and sourcing was, or what corporate was doing, or anything like that. But as I started kind of looking around, and you kind of in that type of a role, you cycle through, and it's kind of the Pareto principle, where you can get a lot of the learnings in the first year or two, the 80-20 idea, that you can pick up 80% of the learnings, and then that last 20% incrementally is probably going to take years to become the best analyst, possible. So having kind of developed that base there, I was interested in getting into something that would push me a little more quickly into areas where I wasn't comfortable. And a big portion when I started talking to the teams at corporate was talking about the presentation, and that's something that I really like the idea. Very high attention to detail, constantly presenting to groups, being a good communicator. So things that I think I'm naturally good at, but hadn't necessarily had a lot of focus on in the past. And then also just getting into a position that was more strategic, as opposed to some quantifying and troubleshooting and the different things that you'll see analysts working on. I'm getting to move into a position that had a little bit larger, like, I guess, system implications and those types of things was a big draw. So that was kind of where it happened. There were a lot of people I talked to, a lot of things that were considered, but ultimately I think it was a good way to kind of pretty quickly get a little higher level view of the organization, having come in sort of in that role supporting the day-to-day operations. Really helps with the understanding of how the organization functions as a whole, but then you do need to still zoom out and see the bigger picture and some of the bigger strategic things that are being worked on.
So you mentioned the Pareto principle and the 80-20 rule. For the listeners, why would it not be a great idea to set your goal to just become the best possible analyst?
Well, for some people that is the best goal. I'm not, we have obviously analysts that work through that role and can blossom into many different types of careers down the road. For me, it's kind of a concept of building a skill stack that doesn't rely upon being the largest expert in a given area, but is rather looking at stacking a unique set of skills that can have synergies that maybe you wouldn't expect. So someone with an analyst background moving into a role where you're designing, medical contracts, that's a unique skill set. I'm one of, a handful of people that came from the analyst side to that role. As I continue with my career building those different things out, it's going to continue being a smaller and smaller group of people that I'm competing with. So I think if you do stay in the exact same role, that can work, but it really needs to be because you love the work that you're doing, and you something that you're fine doing pretty similar work and refining it. If you're into process improvement, you really have to know a process thoroughly. I think that would be a reason to stay in a very similar role for a long time. But if you're wanting to understand bigger picture organizational objectives, then you are going to have to move around a little bit and do things that you're not comfortable with to kind of accelerate that learning curve, I think.
And the money.
And you get paid more if you move roles. And that is a fair point. Being willing to move, being willing to switch companies and those types of things are obviously giant differentiators in how quickly you can increase your pay.
Yeah, but I do take your point on the diversified skill set. And John and I are both big fans of Naval Ravikant, and he has an amazing series of tweets that turned into a podcast on how to get rich without getting lucky. And one of the concepts he talked about in there is it's going to be very hard to become the best analyst in the entire world. It's much easier to become the best person who knows how to communicate and negotiate contracts, understands the analyst's role, and has maybe some technical proficiency like working with SQL databases in your organization. Much easier to become the best person in your entire organization who knows all three of those things than it is to become the leading expert in any one of them. And I think that is something definitely that I have seen as well in my career that's helped me out a lot, is when I have a moderate level of knowledge about a few different areas that aren't commonly found in one employee. Have you seen that play out so far in the time that you've been over on the resource group side?
That's a good question. And I think I would say yes. It's a little bit different when you're within an organization because you're going to have so many sort of advantages just having seen the organization from a couple of different perspectives. So I don't want to necessarily conflate that with, oh, I have these super unique skill sets that are, a great synergy that would translate to any other organization.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at it from a high level. The quantitative understandings I developed as an analyst and with my sort of interest leading into that, now with sort of some of the medical device understanding and larger, bigger picture things, bigger picture strategic healthcare things that are going on. I think those are probably the things that would sort of be able to leverage in a role moving forward. I think right now there's an element of being able to use some of those skills that were picked up in the previous world, but it's not all attributable to the skills themselves. A lot of it is learning the organization and the processes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Makes sense. So speaking of skills, what were the hardest skills to pick up initially when you left school and entered that analyst role?
Fair question. We did a lot of the analytics just in Excel, and even the analytics we were doing, it was a lot more about data cleaning and understanding data and data sources and data quality. It wasn't necessarily just here's a data set, you're super smart, figure out what's going on here, right? If you're looking at variance and budgeting, which you're familiar with, obviously, it's more about discovering what's going on with the business than it is some regression analysis or predictive modeling or those types of things. So nothing on the technical side was that overwhelming. A lot of it was just coming into healthcare cold, and all of the terminology that was being used was completely new to me. So starting to build a reference point out where, I even knew it was being talked about. It's like OR3 has got this, everything. It was all overwhelming at first. So learning some of the language that's being used, that was something that going into my business career, I remember reading a Mark Cuban quote where he said, a business degree is good only because it will teach you the vocabulary. And I would say that now, even more so, I believe that the vocabulary is just so important in being able to understand what you're needing to do and what's going on around you. So I think that was probably the biggest hurdle for me starting out.
Yeah, I totally relate to that. And when I first joined my company, which maybe I'll talk about on another podcast,
Am
I
I supposed to be asking you questions here?
no,
Now,
maybe
now I
let me
feel now I feel bad.
maybe we'll do a episode where we flip the script. But I had the exact same experience coming out of school into a really large organization where just understanding the lay of the land is hard, and so many acronyms and abbreviations, and people that have been at the company 10 years, they don't even think twice about using, these 3-letter team names and all these different acronyms, and not just like the common ones that you would think of as like a business acronym like ASAP or something. Like talking about made up internal acronyms that nobody who hasn't worked at that company would know what they mean. So I definitely relate to that, and I actually kept a list of acronyms that I heard because I didn't want to sound just unbelievably ignorant. And at the time, I didn't realize that they were not standard business acronyms. They were basically like a secret
Right.
language at my company. So I didn't want to just like every time someone used an acronym be like, I don't know what that means. And to be fair, some of them actually were standard business acronyms too. Like there's things like CPU, ASP, like cost per unit, average selling price. Like some of these probably are somewhat standard. I would admit, well, those are standard. But those would also be mixed in with other ones like ODS, which is just the name of a random team, and stuff like that. So yeah, I kept the list that got long. I mean, probably 50 different acronyms
Yeah.
like that. And then I would sort of slowly, when I had a one-on-one with somebody, I'd just ask each person a few and spread it out across the org. But yeah, so that, I think that's a real common thing. And then the other thing you mentioned was data analytics and quality. When I started off in finance, and when I entered the role, I thought that finance was going to be a lot of complex modeling, maybe some of the stuff I did in econometrics, like you were saying, with like regressions and statistical forecasting. And actually it's almost everything is either in Excel or an Oracle system that was invented in the 90s.
Yeah.
And so data quality and just understanding where the data come from, what it means, and how to reconcile it to reality, that is so much more important. Understanding the data sources, like what different column headers really represent, so that there, you might have a couple different quantity fields, and understanding, well, this one is actual eaches, like units, and then this one is the number of boxes. But this SKU has 12 eaches in a box, and this SKU is just one. So it's and all of those little nuances. That's a lot of what I spent time on when I first started working as well. Definitely not fancy analytics.
Yeah, there's a lot of value just in being able to properly explain what is currently happening, and then leadership will decide what they think they should do with that information. From my experience, it's a romanticized idea of analytics that you're pulling these strategic, amazing things out of the data that you can say, listen, look at what I found. You're just saying, here's the picture as accurately as I see it.
Absolutely. I mean, not that there isn't a growing place for more complex analytics, I think, in some companies, but it's still an early stage. It's early in the wave of actually implementing complex analytics that are the source of the insight. Generally, and I think you said that really well, like generally as an analyst, your job is not to analyze. Your job is actually to just present the data on what is currently happening to the like seasoned veterans in your department who will know what it means and what to do about it just from their past business experience
Yeah.
immediately. All they need to know is what is the reality of the situation today. And what is there, sort of, is it growing or declining? How fast? And at a high level, what percentage of the total pie does this area we're focused on represent? And somebody who's been doing the job for 15 years will just immediately be like, okay, and then this is a strategy we pursue, and then go execute on that.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. There are, in our company, there's some teams that are starting to work on some of the more advanced predictive modeling and those types of things. And I don't think it's not a reflection upon the skills of the analyst. It's more about where the data is at in healthcare. So I think as the data, and it's even within our organization gotten significantly better since I've joined, as the data gets better, hopefully that will be automated, painting the picture of where we're at, and bigger problems can be tackled. And there's probably percentage points of inefficiency that can still be driven out just by improving that data flow.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So I think we've covered where you're at and kind of how you got there within your current organization, the serious stuff. So now we're going to take it way back and lead up to sort of how you ended up where you are as a person and a professional. So can you just take us back to the beginning? Growing up as a child, what were you like, and what was your early years like?
Well, it was very, very cool as a child, as you can well imagine and know. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think it's kind of funny because up until I think my first interview with the resource group, I was juggling AirPods here. I was referencing some of my interest in analytics because of my love of baseball. So growing up a huge baseball fan and playing baseball at a competitive level, I played through 4 years of college. That really shaped a lot of my initial sort of ambition, to be great at something. Baseball's an amazing game. So that was just a classic American story of following the dream of being a baseball player. But with that comes a lot of that love of numbers and statistics. And, there's people who are familiar right now with sabermetrics, some of the forerunners to the advanced metrics that are now quoted on ESPN, like WAR and FIP and just all these different things you'll hear about. Are Bill James started in the 80s writing these abstracts on statistics that try to quantify events in baseball and standardize them so you can compare different types of players and across positions, pitchers against batters. So I was reading that from a very young age, and then you start getting into some of the more recent, analytic developments that were happening in the 2000s with Moneyball. A lot of people have seen that movies with Brad Pitt playing Billy Beane, and just this idea that there's something in the data that can transform an organization and give you this giant competitive advantage is a very, very exciting idea, not only in sports, but also in business. And that's what Moneyball is all about, is they were the first people to realize that on-base percentage correlated more closely to run scoring than batting average did, or than slugging percentage did. So they were able to buy all these undervalued assets. They brought in all these players that could get on base at extraordinary clips that other teams basically didn't want. And they, would win 100 games every year and go into the playoffs and everything like that. So that was a lot of kind of what led me, I think, to have this interest in sort of business and numbers and data and those types of things. And then, of course, as I would be remiss for not mentioning, reading Robert Kiyosaki, who's a very famous business writer. He's kind of in like the seminar, I don't think he's get rich quick, but he's kind of, definitely paints a picture of what a life of kind of ambition and being strategic about the decisions you make and how to build assets and think about assets and liabilities and run your life as a balance sheet. I don't remember all of his principles. It's been a while, but reading that book when I think I was around 11, I think you read it shortly thereafter. That was kind of something that sort of planted a seed of, okay, there's the option to do big things here. You can go out and you can build something really special if you put your mind to it. And I honestly think that was one of the big things that at least set the course in my life for being ambitious and willing to work hard in a career and try to push forward, even when it was sometimes sacrificing other things, sometimes not having the best social life or moving far away from family and that type of thing. So those were some of the big picture things that kind of set the stage, I guess, for where I'm at today.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's not go any deeper here.
Oh, I was,
Quick.
yeah, no, I'm definitely going to be double clicking here a little deeper. At 11 years old, how did you get your hands on a business book like, Robert Kiyosaki? It seems like a little dense reading material, you would think, for an 11-year-old.
Yeah, well, I was 11, so I actually couldn't read yet. So I was just looking at the pictures, but I really didn't sheet flow as well at the time. So my family definitely has an entrepreneurial bend to it. I can't even remember the exact ages now, but around that time period, my parents bought a t-shirt printing business. So I actually worked at that business. That was like my first job. I think they paid me some criminal wage of like $100 a week or a month. With me not knowing the market rate of my skills, just accepted it without batting an eye. So so they bought that business. So I kind of was exposed to that. I remember like doing QuickBook entries, and I was probably 10 or 11. Um, so there was that in the background. So my parents were very much interested in exploring those types of ideas. And so my dad gave me the book. I think wanting that to, as parents do, they want the best for their kids. And so I think his idea was to kind of plant that seed of maybe thinking ahead a little bit about setting yourself up for financial success.
Yeah. And then outside of the print shop business, what did your family do for work?
So my dad's a social studies teacher. So he's taught at Willard High School, which is the high school I attended since like late 90s, I think. And he actually retired this year. My mom has worked at her family's business, which is also a print shop, printing paper, which is very cool, 60-plus-year-old business that's very successful in the Kansas City area. She's worked there part time. She was a stay-at-home mom for a period of time because I have four siblings. And then she taught some preschools, did some like groups and different things like that. And then she was actually the one that worked full time at the t-shirt printing business. So she did that for 2 or 3 years until we sold it.
Gotcha. Yeah. And what did your education look like up until high school?
So I was actually homeschooled until
You don't say.
grade. Cut. Yeah, so I was homeschooled, which involved, a lot of just, the standard curriculum when you're younger. And of course, I think fifth, sixth grade, adults can basically teach you anything without too much stress, pretty straightforward stuff. My family read a ton. So we were reading like Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, Homer, Iliad and the Odyssey at a very young age.
I think I remember that.
Yeah, it was painful. My dad
Brutal.
wake us up and teach us Latin for some reason. No, I wish I knew more Latin. It was a good foundational thing to allow me to understand a couple of aspects of grammar. But yeah, so that was kind of like a classical education leading up to that. And then from, kind of the late, whatever, seventh, eighth, ninth grade, those types of years, you start getting into material that some of it is actually self-taught. You're going through things that your parents don't have time to learn an entire curriculum, so they're helping guide through it. But a lot of that, I think, started with at least establishing sort of a level of taking responsibility for things and being able to, do things that were not just here's a checklist, get it done. Having to be self-directed and those types of things.
Yeah. So here's actually something that I don't know that we've spent a lot of time talking about recently. Education, thinking ahead to like when you have kids, do you think, how do you think that you will educate them? Like because I've thought about this a bit in terms of, homeschooling versus public school versus private school, which fingers crossed will be an option by the time that we have kids. Have you
Not with one another, but yeah.
Right. Yes. Separately, with our wives that we will eventually meet, maybe, if we can ever get off quarantine and get out of our houses.
That's right. There's absolutely no interacting at this point because social distancing is required.
Yeah. But it is an interesting question, because I actually was talking with my brother and his girlfriend earlier today, and we started talking about school and how, I think in different ways I felt that, I was either over prepared or, like ahead of the game or behind the curve in certain areas when I got to college level, especially. And I'm sure that you and I have talked about this at some point in the past, but I guess we don't need to plan our kids' lives necessarily right here on the podcast, but we could. But I guess the question.
Yeah. From a high level, I do plan on shoving my broken dreams down their throats and living vicariously through them.
So private school.
What to do to make that happen?
Yeah, private school straight to the Ivies with SAT coaching starting at 11 years old is probably on the menu then, I'm thinking.
Mm.
But in all seriousness, how do you think that you were ahead and behind? Because I assume there was aspects of both by the time you got to, I guess, high school or even higher education.
I think so. Breaking it down, the two kind of main disciplines being sort of quantitative and or what do you call that? Vocabulary.
So behind in vocabulary.
Yeah. So my verbal was strong just from all the reading that was done. Like a lot of it just read to me and those types of things. I wasn't like a giant reader when I was growing up, nor am I now. So the
yeah, we're gonna need a AirPod swap there.
Yeah, so that took care of a lot of the verbal side of things. And then I was fortunate enough to have an amazing math teacher my sophomore year that really sort of gave me a love and a confidence in my abilities in mathematics. So I don't know that going into it, I was necessarily super prepared for that, kind of advanced mathematics and those types of things. But my sophomore and junior years, I had Mrs. Menditto, if you're out there, and she was just an amazing teacher. But I think a lot of the confidence that I built there, and setting the curve and that type of thing, you just go, okay, I'm smart, I'm good at math, and then that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that kind of took care of both sides of, I think, my preparation for college and eventually graduate work. But I think looking forward or looking ahead, things that could be done differently. I think we're going to have to be pretty flexible because the education system is changing so much. I saw a really interesting tweet recently that was, so colleges are going to have to, if we don't have a standard school year next year, they're going to have to sell online education for 1 year and then reconvince everyone that they have to come to school the next year. So it's like this exercise where you have to sell your competitor's product for a year. So we'll see how that flows through, and if that starts taking a chunk out of the education system as it currently stands, because I don't think either of us are super overwhelmed with the quality of the educations we received in college. And so we'll see about that. I think I would like to do things similar that my parents did and kind of giving the flexibility to explore things that interest you. I would probably have a little bit stronger bend on some of the technical things. So I'd probably want to push a little, or at least be aware of some of the opportunities that are out there in some of the STEM type fields and understanding you can get that background without committing to a life as a scientist or, with this super technical work, or even engineering would be a great backdrop to have to do a lot of different things.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, this is a conversation I feel like I could have for an hour, and I haven't spent that much time thinking about it recently. But when you just said the STEM thing, if my kids do not learn basic programming in high school, I'm going to be enraged. That would be absolutely ridiculous by the time I have kids if learning some basic coding. I'm not saying like you don't have to be ready to go get a software engineering job, but if you can't like write a basic website in HTML and maybe you've done a little bit of scripting, some type of scripting language like Ruby or Python or something, like why are you even going to high school at that point? And yeah, and also your point about the colleges having to sell their competitors' product. I mean, it makes so much sense to have somewhat of a at least partially flipped classroom model where you're taking lectures from home over video calls and then you're going into school to like take tests or do labs or group projects or that kind of thing. And I think across education and the general economy, everybody is realizing due to this 2020 COVID-19 crisis that we actually do have like the infrastructure in place from, we're recording this podcast right now. First time we've done it with technology that for the most part we already had available to us, just plus these handy little microphones, $55 on Amazon, if anybody's curious, link in the description.
The affiliate link.
Well, I'll have to figure out if that's possible, but I'm hoping.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's no reason why education can't take up the same model. And yeah, it'll be really interesting to see where that goes.
Yeah, I know you're kind of joking about, SAT prep and Ivy League, but I think by the time our kids are that age, it's probably going to be so much different of a view on it, unless you're going into, I assume medical field will still have kind of the same gatekeeping mechanisms in place. Law would ostensibly as well, but outside of those, anything, being a creative type or having any of these other technical skills, just seems like there's going to be so many other ways to get these jobs that have high credibility outside of getting a degree at the best university possible.
I absolutely hope so. And I think that would make so much more sense. A competency testing based model. I mean, last year, Google actually officially dropped the college degree requirement to apply to Google, and other companies followed suit. So far, it's primarily been in the tech sphere. And I think they're innovative in that area because tech companies are good at actually assessing your ability to get the job done in a way that you can demonstrate in a 90-minute interview. I think a lot of other industries have trouble with that, so they use the degree as a signaling, sort of a signaling metric.
And a pretty good one to a degree. If you're looking at the workforce, the types of workforces we're in, for the most part, you need to be reliable and conscientious and willing to work pretty hard, and you'll do a pretty good job. So I kind of see the argument from that side, but as more and more of the administrative pieces of our jobs get automated and there's more need for creativity and strategic thinking, maybe that'll start to follow suit in some of these other industries.
Yeah, I hope so. Okay, so post high school, you baseball player, you went to SBU?
Southwest Baptist, yeah.
On a partial baseball scholarship to pitch?
Correct, yep.
And then, but you mentioned you started at the resource group out of Mizzou. So what happened in those interim years and how do you think about that strategy?
It's a haze of alcohol and drugs, so I can't tell you too many details, but basically when I finished up at SBU actually does have a very good business program on the kind of standardized testing. They do very well on like the exit exam type thing compared to other universities. But I wasn't necessarily prepared in the sense that I'd been going and getting the competitive internships. I'd been playing baseball in the summers and training and been really focused on the baseball aspect in undergrad. So kind of as a jumping off point, I went to grad school. I did well on the GMAT and got offered a good package to go to school, become a TA there. What does that even stand for? I can't remember.
Teacher's assistant?
I think that's right, yeah. It's been a while. There's GA, there's the grad, TA and GA. So instructed finance there. which was kind of like the first real world job experience I had. Because basically, I always kind of tell the story going from SBU, we had classrooms of like 15, is a tiny school, to teaching rooms of 60 at Mizzou. That was quite a jump in like 3 or 4 month span. But kind of the idea there was just to, and looking back, I'm sure a lot of different paths could have worked out. But I think at the time, what I was trying to do is just get a little better exit opportunity, spend a couple of years focusing on really prepping to enter the professional world. And that did happen, whether or not there were other options available to me at the time that I should have gone down. I'm not saying that's not the case, but and just in terms of kind of using the networking at Mizzou and getting a little bit of the polish that you get with an MBA program, I think it was kind of exactly as advertised and as you would expect.
Fair enough. Okay, so now I want to, as we sort of round third base, to use a baseball analogy, sports, I want to look towards the future. So, first question here is, what is your overarching why? What some days in, corporate jobs, I can attest are not, you get out of bed and you're not necessarily exactly dancing your way into the office. And yet we still make it there extremely reliably. Because reliability is important. And actually, I don't know why I feel the need to go off on a side rant here, but like there is a point to be made that is probably not needed to be made right now. One of the things we're getting paid for is just showing up and being there consistently. I don't know why
can do that.
yeah, I don't know why I feel the need to clarify this, but consistency is important. Like, there's a lot of leeway. There's a lot of really great like leeway given when you work at a great large corporate company, because they can really, if they have the culture to do it, they can really take care of their employees. And I've really been feeling that personally, actually, right now. And I think you have too. I mean, we're currently in the midst of just one of the largest disaster. I mean, I guess really certainly the largest public health disaster, potentially the largest economic disaster, remains to be seen, of our lifetime. And our work life has been largely uninterrupted, which is actually unbelievable and very, very awesome. But anyways, so I'm really just going mad off in different directions on tangents here. But yeah, the original thought there was, just that being consistent is important. And so in order to be consistent, you need some sort of force that's driving you towards that consistency, even when you don't necessarily feel like, getting out of bed and doing another day's work. So yeah, can you just tell us, what is that sort of driving personal mission statement for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think there are two that I would talk about here. And I think the first one is probably more realistic and sort of the real answer. And the second one is a little bit more aspirational and what I would like it to be, I guess. So the first one is because I have an ego and a reputation with myself that I'm effective and hardworking and the kind of person that people can rely on and does a good job. Like all of these things are self-fulfilling prophecies, and I've just always had them. So I think that is ultimately what drives the day-to-day consistency of just showing up and, for the most part, doing a really good job. We can talk about obviously things within our work and our company, but I think those are real, but they're secondary because we would be showing up and doing a good job in any company, and we will probably at some point in other companies. And then I think the idea that would be a little bit more aspirational, I think, is just wanting to have something that you felt like you were not working on, that was just you expressing yourself creatively, and you're driving towards a goal that was, you felt like you were leaving a lasting mark or making a difference that changed the world or changed people, while also providing yourself freedom from needing to do things you didn't want to do. So both of those things can be financial, i.e., if you're doing something exciting that gives you a lot of money, less people can tell you what to do. Or if you're doing something that you love so much that you would never want to do anything else, then you're kind of free in that sense as well. So I think freedom is the one that's a little bit harder to remember and drive at, but is probably one we'd like to get towards.
Yeah, and so with that in mind, what are your future career aspirations?
Yeah. So, I mean, ultimately, I think in order to achieve that freedom, you have to own things. So I've started, as you know, and as you have as well, looking into real estate as kind of a jumping off point for trying to own something. So right now I have this background up because I'm in a construction zone. I'm doing a slow flip here with a house I bought about a year ago that I'll sell in about a year. So starting to get involved in that is a was a good first step and a good like quantifiable step into okay, we're doing a project to build something here. And then I'm also trying to set myself up. I've done a handful of side projects. I've done little businesses that I've tried to start up on the side, Amazon, FBA drop shipping, different little bit of side work here and there. But just trying to explore and find things that are interesting. So obviously, right now we're working on publishing an ebook and those types of things. But I think a big portion of it is also trying to leverage what I'm learning in the workforce right now and in a very specific industry to be able to make a difference in that industry. So I think something in healthcare would make a lot of sense that I'd like to stack on top of some of those finance skills and different things. But ultimately, you have to own it. So it will require building something outside of just a standard corporate career for sure.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast, getting the first episode under our belt. I know it's been a little nerve-wracking for me just getting on camera and talking about these topics and knowing or hoping that somebody may listen, but also kind of worried about what they might think of this V1 of the podcast. But it's been a pleasure talking to you. If anybody wants to learn more about you or what you're doing or ask you for advice on how to get into your industry, where can they find you?
LinkedIn's probably the best place. It's one of the few social medias that I reliably check. So John Latham on LinkedIn. If you need to search the resource group as well, I'm sure I'll come up, and anyone can feel free to add me or message me, and I'm always happy to have a conversation or share knowledge or network or really anything. So looking forward to hearing from anyone that may reach out, and really appreciate you having me on here. This is a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Glad to have you. So with that, we'll call it a wrap and we'll see everybody on the next podcast. Peace.